Welcome, friends. I'm so glad you're here. Whether you're drifting towards sleep, unwinding after a long day, or simply looking for a quiet companion, you found the right place. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from. Perhaps you're wrapped in a blanket, sitting by a softly lit window, or resting somewhere under an open sky. Wherever you are, I hope you're warm, comfortable, and ready to wander with me into Earth's first forests, those ancient groves that grew when continents lay bare and silent under different stars. If you find peace or curiosity in these gentle stories, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, or sharing it with someone who might need a moment of stillness too. And to those who've already joined along, thank you. 385 million years pass like slow breath across stone. The Devonian sun rises over landscapes that know no green shadows, no rustling leaves, no soft carpet of fallen matter beneath wandering feet. Continents stretch naked under patient sky, endless expanses of weathered granite and basalt, painted in ochre and rust by iron's slow surrender to oxygen. Rivers carve their lonely channels through barren valleys, carrying nothing but mineral sediment toward waiting seas. The silence holds a quality unknown to modern ears: no insect hum, no bird call, no whisper of wind through canopy. Only the eternal conversation between water and stone, the quiet percussion of weather against naked rock. Yet something stirs in the margins between water and stone. Along riverbanks and coastal plains, where moisture lingers longest in morning air, primitive plants extend their first experimental roots beyond the shallow rhizomes of their algal ancestors. These early pioneers, Cooksonia and its contemporaries, stand no taller than a human hand, their simple stems crowned with spore-bearing capsules that release genetic potential into wind that has never carried pollen. They cluster in quiet communities where groundwater seeps closest to surface, forming Earth's first terrestrial gardens in places where ancient streams meander through lowland basins. The roots themselves become Earth's first patient miners. They probe deeper than any life before, secreting weak acids that dissolve feldspar and mica grain by grain. Carbonic acid forms where plant-produced carbon dioxide mingles with soil moisture, creating a gentle chemistry that transforms solid granite into clay and soluble nutrients. This chemical weathering accelerates beyond anything the planet has known, as living chemistry meets geological time in quiet partnership. Each root hair becomes a microscopic engine of transformation, trading plant sugars for mineral nutrients in transactions that will repeat trillions of times across coming millennia. The process unfolds with the patience of mountains. Individual plants live perhaps a season, perhaps several years, but their collective influence accumulates like sediment in a delta, where once rainwater simply ran across impermeable bedrock, now it soaks into developing soil horizons. Where once freeze-thaw cycles alone cracked stone, now organic acids accelerate the dissolution of mineral grains. The interface between biology and geology becomes increasingly complex as living systems begin to engineer their own environments on a scale never before achieved. Scientists puzzle over exactly when these first deep roots appeared, their fossil traces often too delicate to preserve in ancient sediments. Root systems rarely fossilize with the same fidelity as stems and leaves, leaving paleobotanists to infer their presence from indirect evidence patterns of soil disruption, chemical signatures in ancient rocks, the distribution of early plant communities across reconstructed landscapes. The transition from simple rhizoids to complex root systems remains partially veiled, a mystery written in rocks that hold their secrets close. Perhaps the roots evolved gradually, or perhaps they emerged in sudden bursts of innovation, time moves too slowly at this scale for certainty. The atmospheric chemistry of this ancient world differs profoundly from modern conditions. Carbon dioxide concentrations hover at levels that would seem catastrophic to contemporary life, while oxygen remains scarce compared to today's abundance. Early plants photosynthesize in this high-carbon atmosphere like algae in a vast greenhouse, converting atmospheric carbon into cellulose and lignin at rates that will fundamentally alter global climate over geological time. Each molecule of carbon dioxide extracted from the atmosphere represents a tiny victory in the slow transformation of Earth's chemical balance. Only took 4 billion years for life to discover that stone could be convinced to feed it. The invasion of land proceeds with geological patience, one root at a time, one season at a time. While continents drift imperceptibly toward configurations that will not exist for hundreds of millions of years, Laurussia and Gondwana move toward their eventual collision. But at velocities measured in centimeters per year, the pace of growing fingernails, the speed of geological dreams, each small plant pushes the boundary between the living and mineral worlds a little farther inland, like green tide advancing across eternity. The early root systems develop strategies that will persist in forests for hundreds of millions of years. Some species send down taproots that probe deep for groundwater, while others spread lateral networks that capture surface moisture from brief rains. Mycorrhizal associations begin to form partnerships between plant roots and fungal networks that expand the effective reach of each individual plant's nutrient-gathering capacity. These fungal collaborations represent one of evolution's most enduring innovations, a symbiosis that will eventually span continents and connect entire forest ecosystems in underground webs of mutual support. In valleys where morning mist collects, these humble pioneers begin the quiet work of making soil from solid rock. Their roots crack granite with the persistence of ice, while their photosynthesis pulls carbon from an atmosphere that holds 10 times more of it than modern air. The carbon becomes cellulose, becomes structure, becomes the first wooden skeletons that will one day fall and fossilize into coal. Organic matter begins to accumulate in the spaces between mineral grains, creating the first true soil's complex mixtures of weathered rock, decaying plant material, and the microscopic communities that will process organic matter for eons to come. The transformation proceeds with the kind of patience that only geological time can teach. Each growing season deposits another thin layer of organic matter into developing soil profiles. Each winter's freeze-thaw cycle opens new cracks for roots to explore. Each storm brings sediment and nutrients from distant highlands, building the substrate that will support increasingly complex plant communities. The naked continents begin their slow dress in green. One root system at a time, one fallen leaf at a time, one grain of weathered feldspar at a time. The migration inland unfolds with the measured pace of continental drift itself. Early vascular plants develop their revolutionary plumbing systems, xylem and phloem microscopic pipelines that carry water upward from roots and sugars downward from primitive leaves. These conducting tissues represent one of evolution's most elegant solutions to the challenge of terrestrial life: how to maintain cellular hydration when separated from the aquatic environments where life first flourished. The xylem cells themselves become architectural marvels, their walls reinforced with lignin polymers that provide both structural support and waterproof transport channels. Baragwanathia longifolia extends club-like stems across the margins of ancient floodplains, its simple leaves arranged in spiral patterns that maximize light capture while minimizing water loss. Each leaf surface develops a waxy cuticle, another innovation that will persist through geological ages, creating a barrier against evaporation that allows plants to venture into increasingly arid environments. The stomata, those microscopic pores that regulate gas exchange, begin their eternal dance of opening and closing in response to light, humidity, and atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. The vascular system operates on principles that seem almost engineered in their efficiency. Transpiration creates negative pressure within the xylem columns, drawing water upward through capillary action enhanced by the cohesive properties of water molecules themselves. This transpirational pull can lift water to heights that will eventually reach the crowns of trees hundreds of feet tall. But in these early Devonian landscapes, even a few inches of elevation represents a significant achievement in the conquest of gravity. Scientists trace the evolution of vascular tissue through fossilized cross-sections preserved in ancient sediments, examining the cellular architecture that enabled this terrestrial revolution. The earliest conducting cells appear relatively simple compared to the complex tissues that will evolve in later plants, yet they represent a fundamental breakthrough in biological engineering. The transition from simple transport by diffusion to active fluid dynamics marks one of the great innovations in the history of life, comparable to the evolution of multicellularity or photosynthesis itself. Water becomes the limiting factor that determines how far these pioneering species can venture from their aquatic origins. In coastal regions where marine influence moderates temperature and humidity, plant communities establish themselves with relative ease. But as they spread inland, toward the centers of vast continents where seasonal extremes grow more pronounced, survival depends increasingly on sophisticated water management strategies. Some species develop succulent tissues that store moisture during abundant periods, while others time their reproductive cycles to coincide with rainy seasons. The atmospheric humidity of the Devonian world differs markedly from modern conditions. Higher carbon dioxide concentrations create a greenhouse effect that maintains elevated temperatures across much of the planet, while the absence of polar ice caps moderates seasonal temperature variation. Yet even in this generally benign climate, the transition from aquatic to terrestrial environments presents formidable challenges. Plants must not only transport water efficiently, but also regulate its loss, maintain cellular integrity during dry periods, and coordinate physiological processes across increasingly complex multicellular structures. Only took 3.5 billion years for life to invent indoor plumbing. The vascular revolution enables plants to colonize environments previously accessible only to microbial life, transforming barren landscapes into increasingly complex ecosystems. Each successful colonist becomes a stepping stone for further expansion, creating microenvironments that retain moisture and moderate temperature extremes for subsequent arrivals. Rhynia major demonstrates the elegance of early vascular design in its fossilized remains from the famous Rhynie chert deposits in Scotland. Its stems contain some of the earliest examples of well-preserved xylem tissue, revealing cellular details that illuminate the mechanics of early terrestrial life. The plants grow in dense stands around hot springs, their roots penetrating silica-rich sediments that preserve extraordinary detail when the organisms become fossilized. These ancient hot spring communities provide windows into ecosystems that existed when terrestrial life was still experimental, still testing the boundaries of what was possible. The biochemistry of water transport requires constant innovation. Plants develop aquaporins, specialized proteins that regulate water movement across cellular membranes, allowing precise control over hydration levels in different tissues. Root cells evolve selective permeability, screening nutrients from soil solution while excluding potentially toxic compounds. The coordination between root uptake, stem transport, and leaf regulation becomes increasingly sophisticated as plants adapt to environments with unpredictable water availability. Mycorrhizal networks begin to extend the effective reach of primitive root systems, creating underground webs that span distances far greater than individual plants could achieve alone. Fungal hyphae, with their microscopic diameter and vast surface area, explore soil volumes that would be inaccessible to plant roots alone. These partnerships represent one of evolution's most successful collaborations, trading plant-produced carbohydrates for mineral nutrients and water gathered from extensive underground territories. The invasion proceeds along river valleys and coastal plains, following corridors of reliable moisture toward the continental interiors. Pioneer species establish beachheads in favorable microhabitats, then gradually expand their range as local conditions become more hospitable through their own influence on soil development and microclimate. Each successful colonization event creates opportunities for subsequent waves of migration, as plant communities modify their environments in ways that support increasing diversity. Paleobotanists puzzle over the specific mechanisms that enabled this terrestrial expansion, as the fossil record preserves only fragments of what must have been complex ecological interactions. The preservation of soft tissues requires exceptional circumstances, rapid burial in fine sediments, mineralization by silica-rich groundwater, or entombment in amber-like resins that exclude oxygen and decay organisms. Most early terrestrial ecosystems leave only traces spores in sedimentary rocks, chemical signatures in ancient soils, patterns of mineral alteration that suggest biological activity. The physiological innovations that enable terrestrial life emerge through countless small adaptations, each tested against the harsh realities of drought, temperature extremes, and nutrient scarcity. Plants develop increasingly sophisticated root architectures, some sending deep tap roots toward groundwater, while others create shallow, spreading networks that capture surface moisture from brief precipitation events. The diversity of strategies reflects the variety of terrestrial environments being colonized, from seasonally flooded lowlands to well-drained upland slopes. Transport systems become increasingly efficient as plants compete for limited resources in these expanding terrestrial habitats. The evolution of vessels, specialized xylem cells with perforated end walls, will not occur for tens of millions of years, but early conducting tissues already demonstrate remarkable efficiency in moving water and dissolved nutrients across cellular boundaries. The coordination between water uptake, transport, and utilization requires biochemical precision that approaches the sophistication of modern plant physiology. Archaeopteris extends its branching crown across the Devonian landscape like a meditation on the architecture of time itself. These remarkable organisms neither quite fern nor quite seed plant, but something entirely their own, develop the first true secondary growth, adding layers of wood to their stems season after season until they achieve heights that cast genuine shadows across the forest floor. Their trunks thicken through the production of cambial tissue, that thin layer of dividing cells that will become one of evolution's most enduring innovations, persisting unchanged in the trees that populate modern forests 380 million years later. The cellular structure of Archaeopteris wood reveals engineering principles that seem almost deliberate in their efficiency. Tracheids' elongated cells with thick, lignified walls provide both structural support and water transport, their tapered ends overlapping to create continuous pathways for fluid movement from roots to canopy. The arrangement of these cells in radial patterns optimizes strength while minimizing material investment, creating structures capable of supporting their own weight as they grow toward unprecedented heights. Cross-sections of fossilized Archaeopteris trunks show growth rings that record seasonal variations in ancient climates, preserving evidence of wet and dry periods in cellular detail. The foliage of these first trees adopts a strategy that will persist through geological ages, The compound frond, with numerous small leaflets arranged along branching axes that maximize photosynthetic surface area while remaining manageable in terms of structural support and water transport. Each frond operates like a distributed solar collector, with individual leaflets oriented to capture optimal light while avoiding mutual shading. The vascular bundles that supply these leaflets demonstrate remarkable precision in their branching patterns, dividing and subdividing like river deltas to ensure that every photosynthetic cell receives adequate water and nutrients. Scientists studying Archaeopteryx fossils encounter a puzzle that illuminates the complexity of early plant evolution. These organisms reproduce through spores, like ferns, yet their wood anatomy resembles that of seed plants, suggesting evolutionary relationships that don't fit neatly into modern taxonomic categories. The heterospory of Archaeopteryx. The production of both large megaspores and small microspores represents an intermediate step toward the evolution of seeds, though the transition remains incompletely understood. Paleobotanists continue to debate whether these organisms should be classified as primitive gymnosperms or advanced ferns, a question that may reflect the inadequacy of modern categories when applied to ancient innovations. The forest canopy creates Earth's first complex three-dimensional terrestrial habitat, establishing vertical gradients of light, temperature, and humidity that will support increasingly diverse communities of organisms. Near the ground, conditions remain relatively cool and moist, while the upper reaches of the canopy experience greater temperature variation and increased exposure to desiccating winds. These environmental gradients within individual forest stands provide opportunities for ecological specialization that would be impossible in the low-growing plant communities that preceded them. The development of true bark represents another revolutionary innovation in the architecture of terrestrial life. The outer bark of Archaeopteryx protects the vital cambial layer from mechanical damage, insect attack, and fungal infection, while also providing thermal insulation that moderates temperature extremes. The inner bark contains phloem tissue that transports sugars produced by photosynthesis from leaves to roots, completing the circulatory system that enables large plants to coordinate physiological processes across substantial distances. Only took evolution 300 million years to figure out that trees should grow tall to compete for sunlight. The emergence of arborescent habit fundamentally alters the dynamics of plant competition, as species invest increasing amounts of energy and resources in structural support rather than immediate reproduction. This shift toward long-term growth strategies creates opportunities for organisms with extended lifespans to dominate forest ecosystems, establishing the first communities where individual plants might persist for decades or centuries. The root systems of Archaeopteryx extend their influence deep into developing soils, creating the first extensive networks of woody roots that penetrate bedrock and extract nutrients from previously inaccessible mineral sources. These root systems develop contractile properties that allow them to adjust their position in response to soil movement, preventing damage during freeze-thaw cycles or settling of unconsolidated sediments. The biomechanics of large root systems requires sophisticated coordination between structural support and physiological function, as individual roots must be strong enough to anchor massive above-ground structures while maintaining the cellular architecture necessary for nutrient and water transport. The reproductive strategies of these early trees reflect the challenges of life in increasingly terrestrial environments. Spore production requires substantial energy investment, as each spore must contain sufficient resources to germinate and establish independent growth in potentially harsh conditions. The timing of spore release becomes critical, as reproductive efforts must coincide with favorable environmental conditions for germination and early growth. Some Archaeopteryx species appear to have synchronized their reproductive cycles with seasonal patterns, releasing spores during periods of optimal moisture and temperature. The chemical composition of Archaeopteris wood introduces new compounds into terrestrial ecosystems, as lignin polymers create complex three-dimensional networks that resist decomposition by the limited array of organisms capable of breaking down plant tissue. This resistance to decay means that fallen trees accumulate on forest floors, creating the first substantial deposits of woody debris in terrestrial environments. The slow decomposition of this organic matter begins to alter soil chemistry and hydrology, creating conditions that will support increasingly diverse communities of soil organisms. Fossilization preserves remarkable details of Archaeopteris anatomy, including the cellular structure of wood, the arrangement of vascular bundles in leaves, and even the microscopic features of spores. These fossils reveal that early trees achieved remarkable sophistication in their structural organization, developing many of the anatomical features that characterize modern trees. The preservation of such detail requires exceptional circumstances, rapid burial in fine sediments, replacement by silica or other minerals, or protection from oxygen and decay organisms in anaerobic environments. The ecological impact of the first forests extends far beyond the plants themselves, as tree canopies moderate temperature extremes, increase local humidity through transpiration, and create complex patterns of light and shadow that influence the growth and distribution of other organisms. The development of forest microclimates establishes environmental conditions that differ markedly from those in open habitats, providing opportunities for evolutionary innovation among the organisms that colonize these new three-dimensional ecosystems. The geographic distribution of Archaeopteris forests reflects both climatic constraints and the continental configurations of the Devonian world. These trees flourish in temperate regions where seasonal temperature variation remains moderate and annual precipitation provides adequate soil moisture throughout the growing season. The assembly of Pangaea influences global atmospheric circulation patterns, creating regional climates that determine where forest ecosystems can establish and persist across the slowly drifting continents. Oxygen molecules accumulate in the Devonian atmosphere like interest compounding across geological time. The proliferation of terrestrial plants accelerates photosynthesis on a scale unprecedented in Earth's history. As millions of square kilometers of previously barren land surface become colonized by organisms that split water molecules and release oxygen as metabolic waste, each photosynthetic reaction strips electrons from water, liberating oxygen atoms that combine into the diatomic gas that will fundamentally alter the chemistry of atmosphere, ocean, and soil across the entire planet. The atmospheric concentration of oxygen rises from perhaps 12% to nearly 20% during the Middle and Late Devonian, approaching levels that will support the large, active animals of later geological periods. This increase occurs gradually, imperceptibly to any hypothetical observer, but the cumulative effect transforms the oxidative potential of Earth's surface environments. Iron minerals that have remained stable for billions of years begin to rust in the newly oxygenated atmosphere, painting exposed rock surfaces in the reds and browns that characterize oxidized landscapes. The biochemical implications of rising oxygen levels ripple through terrestrial and marine ecosystems in ways that will not become fully apparent for millions of years. Cellular respiration becomes more efficient as oxygen availability increases, enabling organisms to extract more energy from organic compounds through aerobic metabolism. The evolution of more sophisticated respiratory systems becomes possible, though the full exploitation of high oxygen environments will not occur until arthropods develop tracheal systems capable of delivering oxygen directly to individual cells. Scientists studying ancient atmospheres encounter the puzzle of measuring oxygen concentrations from geological evidence, as direct atmospheric samples from the Devonian do not exist. Proxy indicators. The ratios of carbon isotopes in organic matter. The oxidation states of iron in ancient soils. The charcoal content of sedimentary rocks provide indirect evidence of atmospheric composition. The interpretation of these proxies requires careful consideration of local environmental conditions, as regional variations in climate and geology can influence geochemical signatures in ways that complicate global reconstructions. The global carbon cycle experiences fundamental reorganization as terrestrial plants begin storing carbon in woody tissue and soil organic matter on continental scales. Each tree trunk represents thousands of tons of carbon extracted from the atmosphere and locked away in cellulose and lignin polymers. The accumulation of organic matter in forest soils creates the first substantial terrestrial carbon reservoirs, establishing feedback loops between atmospheric composition and biological productivity that will influence global climate for hundreds of millions of years. Marine ecosystems respond to changing atmospheric chemistry through complex interactions between ocean circulation, biological productivity, and chemical weathering. The increase in atmospheric oxygen allows deeper penetration of oxygenated water into marine sediments, altering the biogeochemistry of seafloor environments. Organisms that have evolved in low oxygen conditions experience new selective pressures, while species adapted to higher oxygen levels gain competitive advantages in marine food webs. Only took photosynthesis 2 billion years to accidentally create an atmosphere capable of supporting forest fires. The rising oxygen concentration approaches the threshold where organic matter can sustain combustion, though extensive wildfire activity will not become common until oxygen levels exceed 18%. The first forest fires represent a new form of ecological disturbance, recycling nutrients from accumulated organic matter while creating opportunities for fire-adapted species to colonize disturbed habitats. The oxidation of sulfur compounds in marine environments accelerates as atmospheric oxygen dissolves into seawater, creating more acidic conditions that affect the precipitation of carbonate minerals. Marine organisms that construct calcium carbonate shells and skeletons must expend additional energy to maintain their protective structures in increasingly corrosive seawater. The biogeochemical cycles of sulfur, iron, and phosphorus become coupled in new ways as oxidizing conditions alter the mobility and availability of these essential nutrients. Weathering processes on land intensify as oxygen-rich atmosphere interacts with exposed rock surfaces, accelerating the chemical breakdown of silicate minerals that have remained stable under previous atmospheric conditions. The oxidation of iron-bearing minerals releases nutrients that support plant growth while simultaneously consuming atmospheric oxygen in chemical reactions that proceed slowly but inexorably across continental surfaces. The balance between oxygen production by photosynthesis and oxygen consumption by weathering establishes dynamic equilibrium that regulates atmospheric composition over geological timescales. The development of ozone in the upper atmosphere provides the first effective shield against harmful ultraviolet radiation, enabling organisms to colonize terrestrial environments previously uninhabitable due to DNA damage from solar radiation. The ozone layer forms through photochemical reactions involving oxygen molecules at high altitudes, creating a protective barrier that makes possible the diversification of life in shallow aquatic and terrestrial habitats. This atmospheric chemistry occurs far above the biosphere itself, yet its effects permeate every aspect of biological evolution. Paleontologists studying late Devonian extinction events discover correlations between atmospheric oxygenation and patterns of marine biodiversity loss, suggesting that changing ocean chemistry may have stressed marine ecosystems beyond their adaptive capacity. The extinction of numerous groups of marine organisms, including many species of corals, brachiopods, and trilobites, coincides with evidence for atmospheric change, though the causal mechanisms remain incompletely understood. The complexity of Earth system interactions makes it difficult to isolate the specific effects of atmospheric oxygenation from other environmental changes occurring simultaneously. The physiology of early terrestrial animals begins to reflect adaptation to higher oxygen environments, though most Devonian terrestrial fauna remains small and relatively simple compared to later periods. Arthropods develop more efficient respiratory systems, while early vertebrates experiment with lung structures that will eventually enable them to exploit fully terrestrial habitats. The evolutionary innovations that enable large body sizes and active lifestyles proceed gradually, constrained by the availability of oxygen for cellular respiration. Chemical signatures preserved in ancient sediments record the progressive oxygenation of terrestrial environments. As iron oxides become more abundant in river sediments and paleosols, the red beds that characterize many Devonian terrestrial formations reflect the oxidizing conditions that prevail as atmospheric oxygen concentrations rise toward modern levels. These chemical changes occur invisibly, without dramatic events or sudden transitions, yet they represent one of the most significant transformations in Earth's environmental history. The coupling between terrestrial plant productivity and atmospheric composition establishes feedback mechanisms that will regulate global climate and atmospheric chemistry throughout the remainder of Earth's history. Plants remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere while releasing oxygen, cooling global temperatures while creating conditions that support more diverse and active ecosystems. These biogeochemical cycles operate on timescales that dwarf human experience, yet their cumulative effects shape the environmental conditions that determine which forms of life can exist on Earth's surface. Beneath the soil surface, an invisible revolution unfolds through networks of fungal threads finer than spider silk. Mycorrhizal associations, partnerships between plant roots and fungal hyphae establish the first complex underground ecosystems, creating webs of mutual dependence that span distances far greater than individual organisms could achieve alone. These fungal networks operate like living internet cables, transmitting nutrients, water, and even chemical signals between plants separated by meters or kilometers of soil. The hyphae themselves measure only micrometers in diameter, yet their collective surface area exceeds that of the plant roots they serve by factors of hundreds or thousands. The mechanics of mycorrhizal exchange involve sophisticated biochemical negotiations between organisms that lack nervous systems, yet demonstrate remarkable precision in resource allocation. Fungal partners provide plants with phosphorus, nitrogen, and trace minerals extracted from soil volumes inaccessible to root systems, while receiving carbohydrates produced through plant photosynthesis. The exchange rates adjust dynamically based on the nutritional needs of both partners, creating market-like efficiency in the distribution of limited resources across forest ecosystems. Individual fungal networks can persist for centuries or millennia, far exceeding the lifespans of their plant partners. As trees die and new seedlings germinate, the fungal infrastructure remains intact, providing continuity of nutrient cycling and communication across multiple plant generations. This underground longevity creates institutional memory within forest ecosystems, maintaining ecological relationships and resource distribution patterns that transcend the lives of individual trees. Scientists studying modern mycorrhizal networks encounter organizational complexity that challenges traditional concepts of individual organisms. A single fungal network may simultaneously partner with dozens of plant species, mediating nutrient exchanges and maintaining chemical communication between organisms with dramatically different physiological needs. The boundaries between individual fungi become indistinct as hyphal networks merge and separate in response to changing environmental conditions and resource availability. The chemical communication facilitated by mycorrhizal networks enables plants to share information about environmental stresses, pathogen attacks, and resource availability across considerable distances. When one tree experiences insect herbivory, it can transmit chemical signals through fungal connections that trigger defensive responses in neighboring plants. This early warning system operates below the threshold of human perception, yet it provides forest communities with collective intelligence that exceeds the capabilities of individual plants. Soil architecture becomes increasingly complex as fungal networks bind mineral particles into stable aggregates that resist erosion and maintain pore spaces for water infiltration and gas exchange. The hyphal threads act like microscopic cables, creating three-dimensional scaffolding that supports soil structure while providing pathways for the movement of water, nutrients, and soil organisms. The development of stable soil structure enables the accumulation of organic matter and the establishment of the complex biogeochemical cycles that characterize mature forest ecosystems. Only took fungi 3 billion years to discover that cooperation beats competition when resources are scarce. The evolution of mycorrhizal partnerships represents one of the most successful collaborative strategies in the history of life, enabling terrestrial plants to colonize nutrient-poor soils that would otherwise remain uninhabitable. The partnership allows plants to access mineral nutrients locked in bedrock and organic matter while providing fungi with reliable sources of carbohydrates that would be difficult to obtain through independent metabolism. The diversity of mycorrhizal associations reflects the variety of soil conditions and plant communities that characterize terrestrial ecosystems. Some partnerships involve fungi that form extensive networks connecting multiple plant species, while others remain relatively localized around individual root systems. The specificity of fungal plant associations varies considerably, with some fungi capable of partnering with numerous plant species, while others maintain exclusive relationships with particular hosts. Phosphorus cycling through mycorrhizal networks demonstrates the biochemical sophistication of these underground partnerships. Fungi produce specialized enzymes that liberate phosphorus from organic compounds and mineral matrices, making this essential nutrient available to plants in forms they cannot access independently. The efficiency of phosphorus transfer through mycorrhizal associations often exceeds the capabilities of synthetic fertilizers, achieving nutrient delivery with minimal energy expenditure and environmental impact. The temporal dynamics of mycorrhizal networks reveal seasonal patterns that mirror the phenology of forest ecosystems. Fungal activity peaks during periods of active plant growth, when carbohydrate supplies from photosynthesis support extensive hyphal proliferation and nutrient gathering. During dormant seasons, fungal networks maintain reduced activity levels while preserving the infrastructure necessary for rapid response to changing conditions. Paleontologists studying early terrestrial plant fossils discover evidence of mycorrhizal associations in some of the oldest known land plants, suggesting that these partnerships may have been essential for the initial colonization of terrestrial environments. Fossilized fungal structures within ancient plant roots reveal anatomical features similar to those of modern mycorrhizal associations, indicating that the basic architecture of these partnerships has remained remarkably stable across hundreds of millions of years of evolution. The biogeography of mycorrhizal networks influences patterns of plant community composition and succession across landscapes with varying soil conditions and disturbance histories. Areas with well-developed fungal networks support more diverse and resilient plant communities, while disturbed sites with disrupted fungal infrastructure require longer recovery periods to establish mature forest structure. The restoration of degraded ecosystems often depends as much on re-establishing mycorrhizal partnerships as on replanting vegetation. Carbon storage in soil organic matter accelerates through mycorrhizal activity, as fungal decomposition of organic compounds proceeds more gradually than bacterial decay processes. The complex organic molecules produced by fungal metabolism resist further decomposition, creating stable carbon compounds that accumulate in soil profiles over decades or centuries. This fungal contribution to soil carbon storage represents a significant component of terrestrial carbon sequestration, influencing global climate through biogeochemical processes that operate largely beneath human observation. The chemical complexity of soil solutions increases dramatically in the presence of active mycorrhizal networks, as fungal metabolism produces diverse organic compounds that influence the availability and mobility of mineral nutrients. These biochemical modifications create unique chemical environments around individual roots, enabling plants to access nutrients that would remain unavailable in purely abiotic soil systems. The sophistication of these chemical modifications approaches that of carefully controlled laboratory conditions, yet it emerges spontaneously through evolutionary processes operating over geological time. Water relations within forest ecosystems become more stable and predictable through mycorrhizal mediation, as fungal networks create distributed systems for water storage and transport that buffer plants against short-term droughts and seasonal variations in precipitation. The extensive surface area of fungal networks enables efficient water absorption during periods of adequate moisture, while the three-dimensional architecture of high-fall systems provides multiple pathways for water movement between soil microsites with different moisture contents. Lignin emerges from the cellular factories of early plants like molecular architecture, designed by chemists who think in 3 dimensions and geological time. This complex polymer, a random network of phenolic compounds cross-linked in patterns too intricate for complete analysis, even with modern instruments, transforms plant cell walls from flexible membranes into rigid structural elements capable of supporting massive trees against gravity's relentless pull. The lignification process occurs molecule by molecule, as specialized enzymes deposit aromatic compounds into cell wall matrices with precision that approaches crystalline regularity, yet maintains the plasticity necessary for continued growth. The chemical bonds within lignin resist almost all forms of biological degradation, creating the first truly permanent biological structures in terrestrial ecosystems. While cellulose and other carbohydrates succumb readily to enzymatic breakdown, lignin persists in soil for decades or centuries, accumulating as the brown, complex organic matter that will eventually transform into coal under geological pressure and heat. The molecular structure of lignin, with its aromatic rings and ether linkages, requires specialized enzymes and specific environmental conditions for decomposition, limiting the organisms capable of recycling this abundant organic polymer. Individual lignin molecules adopt configurations that maximize structural strength while minimizing material investment, creating lattice-like networks that distribute mechanical stress across entire cell walls. The polymerization process proceeds through free radical chemistry that generates unpredictable branching patterns, yet the overall architecture achieves remarkable consistency in its mechanical properties. This controlled randomness produces materials with strength-to-weight ratios that exceed many synthetic polymers, demonstrating evolutionary optimization that operates through molecular scale selection pressures. Scientists studying lignin biochemistry encounter one of the most complex organic polymers produced by living organisms, with molecular weights that can exceed 1 million Daltons and structural heterogeneity that makes precise characterization extremely difficult. Modern analytical techniques reveal broad patterns in lignin composition and architecture, but the specific 3-dimensional arrangement of individual molecules within cell walls remains partially mysterious. The polymer's resistance to chemical analysis reflects the same properties that make it so durable in natural environments. The evolution of lignin biosynthesis requires the coordinated development of multiple enzyme systems, each catalyzing specific steps in the complex pathway from simple precursors to the finished polymer. The genes encoding these enzymes appear gradually in the fossil record of plant evolution, suggesting that lignification capability emerged through incremental modifications of existing metabolic pathways rather than sudden biochemical innovations. The molecular archaeology of lignin biosynthesis reveals ancient biochemical relationships between structural compounds and defensive chemicals that protected early plants from environmental stresses. Carbon sequestration accelerates dramatically with the evolution of lignified plant tissues. As woody biomass accumulates in forest ecosystems faster than decomposer organisms can process it, each tree trunk represents tons of atmospheric carbon locked into molecular structures that resist biological recycling, creating the first substantial terrestrial carbon sinks in Earth's history. The development of lignin-rich plant communities fundamentally alters global carbon cycling, removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at rates that will influence planetary climate for millions of years. Only took evolution 50 million years to accidentally invent a polymer stronger than most plastics. The mechanical properties of lignified wood exceed those of many engineered materials, achieving compressive strengths that enable trees to grow to heights of hundreds of feet while maintaining structural integrity against wind loads and gravitational stress. The cellular architecture of wood, with its alternating layers of thin-walled and thick-walled cells, distributes mechanical forces in patterns that minimize failure while maximizing material efficiency. The biochemical pathways that produce lignin generate numerous intermediate compounds with antimicrobial and anti-herbivore properties, providing plants with chemical defenses that protect vulnerable tissues from attack by fungi, bacteria, and primitive arthropods. These secondary metabolites, flavonoids, tannins, and various phenolic compounds create chemical barriers that complement the physical protection provided by lignified cell walls. The dual function of lignin precursors as both structural components and defensive chemicals illustrates the evolutionary efficiency that emerges when single biochemical pathways serve multiple adaptive functions. Fire behavior in lignin-rich plant communities differs fundamentally from combustion in low lignin vegetation, as the aromatic compounds in wood burn at higher temperatures and produce more complex combustion products. The evolution of lignified plants creates the first ecosystems capable of sustaining intense fires that can spread across landscape scales, establishing new forms of ecological disturbance that will influence plant community dynamics for hundreds of millions of years. The chemical energy stored in lignified biomass exceeds that available in previous terrestrial ecosystems by orders of magnitude. Soil chemistry transforms in response to lignin inputs, as the slow decomposition of woody plant material releases phenolic compounds that alter soil pH, nutrient availability, and microbial community composition. Lignin breakdown products form stable complexes with soil minerals and organic matter, creating humus compounds that persist for centuries and influence soil structure and fertility across geological timescales. The accumulation of lignin-derived organic matter creates the first substantial terrestrial carbon reservoirs, establishing soil carbon pools that will influence global biogeochemical cycles throughout Earth's subsequent history. The mechanical engineering principles embodied in lignified wood demonstrate solutions to structural challenges that will not be formally understood by human engineers until the 20th century. The arrangement of wood cells in radial patterns optimizes strength against bending forces while maintaining efficient transport of water and nutrients. The variation in cell wall thickness and lignin content across growth rings creates composite materials with properties that change seasonally in response to environmental conditions and mechanical stress. Paleobotanists studying fossilized wood encounter preservation of cellular detail that reveals the sophistication of early lignification processes. The chemical stability of lignin enables exceptional fossil preservation, maintaining cellular architecture across hundreds of millions of years with fidelity that allows detailed analysis of ancient wood anatomy. These fossils demonstrate that early trees achieved remarkable sophistication in their structural organization, developing many of the anatomical features that characterize modern woody plants. The geographic distribution of lignin-producing plants correlates with environmental conditions that favor the development of permanent supportive tissues regions, with adequate moisture to support large plant growth, but sufficient seasonal variation to require structural adaptation to mechanical stress. The evolution of woody plant communities proceeds most rapidly in temperate climates, where seasonal temperature and precipitation patterns create selective pressures for both growth and persistence through unfavorable periods. Industrial applications of lignin in modern technology exploit the same chemical properties that made this polymer valuable for structural support in early terrestrial plants. The aromatic structure and cross-linking chemistry of lignin provide raw materials for plastics, adhesives, and composite materials that duplicate many of the functions served by lignified tissues in living plants. The molecular architecture developed through hundreds of millions of years of evolution continues to inspire materials science and biochemical engineering in contemporary research and development. The Devonian seas writhe in the grip of extinction, their ancient rhythms disrupted by chemistry that has turned against life itself. Marine environments that have supported diverse ecosystems for hundreds of millions of years experience cascading collapses as ocean acidity increases and oxygen levels plummet in deep waters. Coral reefs that once stretched across continental shelves bleach and crumble, their calcium carbonate skeletons dissolving in increasingly corrosive seawater. The Frasnian-Furmenian extinction event unfolds across several million years, claiming perhaps 75% of marine species in one of the most severe biodiversity crises in Earth's history. Trilobites, those ancient arthropods that have crawled across seafloors since the Cambrian explosion, dwindle toward extinction as their preferred shallow marine habitats experience repeated episodes of anoxia and acidification. Species that have persisted through previous mass extinctions succumb to environmental changes that exceed their physiological tolerances, their fossilized remains testament to the vulnerability of even highly successful evolutionary lineages. The diversity of trilobite body plans accumulated over 250 million years of evolution contracts rapidly as ecological niches disappear and marine food webs collapse. Brachiopods experience devastating population crashes as ocean chemistry shifts beyond the range they can tolerate for shell construction and maintenance. These filter-feeding organisms, which have dominated marine benthic communities throughout the Paleozoic, lose competitive ground to bivalve mollusks better adapted to variable environmental conditions. The decline of brachiopods represents more than simple species replacement. It marks the reorganization of marine ecosystems around fundamentally different ecological strategies and physiological tolerances. Scientists studying the late Devonian extinctions encounter evidence for multiple interacting environmental stresses that combine to create conditions more severe than any single factor alone could produce. Ocean temperature fluctuations, sea level changes, atmospheric composition shifts, and marine chemistry alterations occur simultaneously, creating cascading effects that propagate through marine ecosystems faster than evolutionary adaptation can respond. The complexity of these interactions makes it difficult to identify single causes for extinction events that likely result from Earth system instabilities, affecting multiple environmental parameters simultaneously. Terrestrial ecosystems remain largely buffered from the marine catastrophe, continuing their expansion across continental surfaces while ocean communities collapse around them. The contrast between marine extinction and terrestrial diversification illustrates the independence of different environmental systems during periods of global change. Plants continue their colonization of land surfaces, developing increasingly sophisticated adaptations to terrestrial life, while marine organisms struggle against deteriorating ocean conditions. The chemistry of extinction operates through mechanisms that remain partially mysterious despite decades of research into ancient ocean conditions. Hydrogen sulfide production in anoxic deep waters creates toxic conditions that spread upward through the water column, while changes in ocean circulation patterns alter the distribution of nutrients and oxygen across marine basins. The acidification of seawater inhibits the formation of calcium carbonate shells and skeletons, making it difficult for many marine organisms to maintain their protective structures. Only took the ocean 350 million years to discover that chemistry changes can end civilizations. The marine mass extinctions of the late Devonian eliminate ecological relationships and evolutionary lineages that represent hundreds of millions of years of adaptive innovation, creating evolutionary bottlenecks that will influence the trajectory of marine life for the remainder of Earth's history. Recovery from mass extinction events requires millions of years as surviving lineages diversify to fill vacant ecological niches. Reef ecosystems suffer particularly severe damage during the extinction intervals, as the organisms that construct carbonate frameworks prove especially vulnerable to ocean acidification and temperature changes. Stromatoporoid sponges and rugose corals that have built massive reef complexes throughout the Middle Paleozoic experience near complete extinction, leaving reef environments dominated by microbial communities and simple invertebrates. The collapse of reef ecosystems eliminates habitat complexity that has supported high levels of marine biodiversity for tens of millions of years. Continental margins experience dramatic reorganization as sea level changes expose vast areas of previously submerged continental shelf, while simultaneously creating new marine basins in other regions. The geographic redistribution of marine environments alters ocean circulation patterns and creates new barriers to organism dispersal, fragmenting previously continuous populations and accelerating speciation and extinction processes. These paleogeographic changes operate on timescales comparable to the extinction event itself, suggesting possible causal relationships between continental drift and biological crisis. The isotopic signatures preserved in marine sediments from the extinction interval record fluctuations in global carbon cycling that reflect massive perturbations to Earth's biogeochemical systems. Carbon isotope ratios shift dramatically as marine productivity declines and terrestrial organic matter accumulates in unprecedented quantities, indicating fundamental changes in the balance between photosynthesis, respiration, and organic matter burial. These geochemical changes provide quantitative evidence for ecosystem collapse on a scale that affects global elemental cycling. Planktonic organisms experience extinction rates that exceed those of bottom-dwelling communities, suggesting that surface ocean conditions become particularly hostile during the crisis intervals. The collapse of marine food webs begins with the organisms that form their foundation, the microscopic algae and bacteria that convert inorganic nutrients into organic matter through photosynthesis and chemosynthesis. Without these primary producers, marine ecosystems lose their energy base and experience cascading extinctions that propagate upward through trophic levels. Survival strategies during mass extinction events favor organisms with broad environmental tolerances, small body sizes, and rapid reproductive rates characteristics that enable quick adaptation to changing conditions and recovery from population bottlenecks. Generalist species that can exploit multiple food sources and habitat types persist through environmental crises that eliminate highly specialized organisms adapted to specific ecological conditions. The selective pressures of mass extinction reshape the fundamental characteristics of surviving lineages in ways that influence evolutionary trajectories for millions of years following the crisis. The geographic patterns of extinction reveal uneven impacts across different marine basins and environmental settings, with some regions experiencing more severe biodiversity loss than others. Tropical marine communities suffer disproportionately high extinction rates, while higher latitude and deep water communities show greater resilience to environmental change. These geographic differences in extinction intensity reflect regional variations in environmental conditions and suggest that climate change plays a significant role in driving biodiversity loss during the late Devonian crisis. Recovery from mass extinction proceeds slowly as surviving organisms diversify to exploit vacant ecological niches, but the new communities that emerge often differ fundamentally in structure and function from those that existed before the crisis. The Devonian extinctions mark the end of the Middle Paleozoic marine fauna and the beginning of evolutionary trends that will characterize marine ecosystems for the remainder of the Paleozoic era. The ecological innovations that emerge during post-extinction recovery periods often represent evolutionary experiments that would not have been possible without the ecological disruption created by mass extinction. The continents drift toward their great convergence with the patience of mountains teaching themselves to dance. Laurussia and Gondwana move across the mantle's slow currents at velocities measured in centimeters per year, the speed of growing fingernails, the pace of geological meditation. The assembly of Pangaea proceeds through tectonic choreography that operates on timescales incomprehensible to biological consciousness, yet its effects ripple through every aspect of terrestrial climate and the distribution of early forest ecosystems across the slowly coalescing supercontinent. Ocean basins widen and narrow as crustal plates respond to convection currents deep within Earth's interior. The Rhyic Ocean contracts while the Panthalassic Ocean expands, redistributing thermal energy across the planet's surface through changes in oceanic circulation patterns that operate like a global thermostat. These alterations in ocean geometry influence the transport of heat from equatorial to polar regions, creating regional climate variations that determine where forest ecosystems can establish and persist across continental surfaces that drift imperceptibly toward new latitudinal positions. Mountain ranges rise along collision zones where continental margins crumple against each other with forces that dwarf any human engineering project. The Akkadian and Caledonian orogenies lift ancient seafloor sediments thousands of meters above sea level, creating highland watersheds that channel precipitation into river systems flowing across increasingly complex topography. The uplift of mountain chains generates orographic precipitation patterns that create rain shadows and moisture corridors, establishing the climatic framework within which terrestrial plant communities will develop their biogeographic distributions. Scientists studying Devonian paleogeography encounter the challenge of reconstructing continental positions from magnetic signatures preserved in ancient rocks. As the slow drift of continents erases evidence of their former arrangements through subsequent tectonic activity, paleomagnetic data provides directional information about ancient magnetic field orientations, while the distribution of similar rock formations and fossil assemblages across now separated continents reveals former geographic connections. The precision of these reconstructions remains limited by the complexity of tectonic processes and the incomplete preservation of ancient magnetic signatures. Climate zones shift across continental surfaces as land masses move through different latitudinal belts, carrying their forest communities into temperature and precipitation regimes for which they may be poorly adapted. Plant communities that develop in tropical conditions find themselves transported into temperate latitudes over millions of years, creating selective pressures for adaptation to seasonal temperature variation and changing photoperiods. The geographic redistribution of climatic conditions drives evolutionary innovation as species adapt to new environmental challenges or face extinction. The configuration of continental margins influences oceanic circulation through changes in the geometry of seaways and the distribution of shallow and deep water masses. Narrow seaways between converging continents restrict the flow of ocean currents, while the opening of new ocean basins allows the development of new circulation patterns that transport heat and nutrients across previously isolated marine regions. These changes in oceanic circulation affect precipitation patterns on adjacent land masses, influencing the water balance that determines forest distribution and composition. Only took plate tectonics 4 billion years to figure out that continental arrangement affects global climate. The slow convergence of Laurussia and Gondwana creates increasingly continental climatic conditions in the interior regions of the developing supercontinent, as distance from oceanic moisture sources increases and seasonal temperature extremes become more pronounced. The development of vast continental interiors creates environmental conditions unlike any that have existed previously in Earth's history. Volcanic activity associated with continental collision introduces massive quantities of gases and ash into the atmosphere, creating short-term climatic perturbations that can persist for decades or centuries. The eruption of flood basalts releases sulfur compounds that reflect solar radiation and cool global temperatures, while simultaneously adding carbon dioxide that enhances greenhouse warming over longer timescales. These volcanic influences on atmospheric composition interact with biological processes to create complex feedbacks between tectonic activity and global climate. The biogeographic consequences of continental drift become apparent in the fossil record, as similar plant communities appear in rocks of similar age on continents that are now widely separated. The distribution of Archaeopteris forests and other early plant assemblages reflects the continental configurations that existed during their development, providing evidence for the former connections between land masses that have since drifted apart. These paleobiogeographic patterns support reconstructions of ancient continental positions, while illustrating the influence of geography on evolutionary processes. Atmospheric circulation patterns reorganize in response to changing continental arrangements. As the development of large land masses creates new barriers to wind flow and alters the distribution of high and low pressure systems. The emergence of vast continental masses influences the development of monsoon systems and seasonal precipitation patterns that will characterize terrestrial climates throughout the remainder of Earth's history. These atmospheric changes create the climatic framework within which terrestrial ecosystems develop their characteristic biogeographic patterns. Sea level fluctuations associated with continental collision and the growth of mountain ranges alter the distribution of shallow marine environments and coastal habitats where terrestrial and marine ecosystems interact. The elevation of continental margins above sea level exposes vast areas of former sea floor to terrestrial colonization, while simultaneously reducing the area of shallow marine habitat available for marine communities. These changes in the distribution of terrestrial and marine environments influence evolutionary processes in both realms. The formation of intercontinental land bridges enables the dispersal of terrestrial organisms between previously isolated land masses, creating opportunities for evolutionary exchange and competition between biotas that have developed in isolation. The connection of formerly separate continents allows the mixing of plant and animal communities that have evolved different adaptive strategies, leading to competitive exclusion of some species and the rapid spread of others across newly available territories. Climate modeling of Devonian atmospheric and oceanic conditions reveals the sensitivity of global climate to continental configuration, as small changes in the arrangement of land masses can produce large changes in temperature and precipitation patterns. The assembly of Pangaea creates climatic conditions that differ fundamentally from those existing when continents were more widely dispersed, establishing environmental parameters that will influence the evolution of terrestrial life throughout the late Paleozoic era. The timing of continental collision correlates with biological events, including mass extinctions and evolutionary radiations, suggesting possible causal relationships between tectonic processes and major changes in Earth's biota. The environmental stresses associated with changing climate and geography may drive evolutionary innovation while simultaneously creating conditions that exceed the adaptive capacity of existing species. These correlations between geological and biological events illustrate the fundamental connections between Earth's physical and biological systems. The first forest floors accumulate like libraries written in languages of decay and renewal. Fallen fronds of Archaeopteris settle into hollows between exposed roots, their complex pinnate leaflets beginning the slow transformation from living tissue to the organic matter that will nourish countless generations of soil organisms yet to evolve. The decomposition process proceeds with deliberate patience, as the limited diversity of Devonian decomposer organisms struggles to break down the novel biochemical compounds, lignin, tannins, complex carbohydrates that terrestrial plants have introduced into Earth's carbon cycle for the first time. Leaf litter creates microenvironments with distinct temperature, humidity, and chemical gradients that persist for months or years as organic matter slowly yields to bacterial and fungal metabolism. Individual leaves maintain their structural integrity for extended periods, their waxy cuticles and lignified tissues resisting the enzymatic processes that would quickly recycle marine organic matter. The accumulation of partially decomposed plant material creates the first substantial deposits of terrestrial organic matter, establishing carbon pools that will influence soil chemistry and structure across geological time. Arthropods, primitive millipedes, early spiders, and ancestral insects colonize these novel forest floor environments, developing feeding strategies that exploit the unprecedented abundance of plant-derived organic matter. These early terrestrial animals lack the sophisticated digestive systems that will later enable efficient processing of cellulose and lignin, so decomposition proceeds primarily through mechanical fragmentation and microbial activity rather than animal digestion. The slow pace of organic matter processing allows substantial accumulations of plant debris that create complex three-dimensional habitats unlike any previously existing terrestrial environments. Scientists studying the formation of early forest soils encounter chemical signatures that record the transition from mineral-dominated to organic matter-rich terrestrial substrates. The accumulation of plant-derived compounds alters soil pH, creates chelating agents that mobilize mineral nutrients, and establishes reducing conditions that influence the oxidation states of iron, sulfur, and other elements. These geochemical changes occur gradually as organic matter accumulates, but their cumulative effects fundamentally transform the chemistry of terrestrial environments. The development of distinct soil horizons begins as organic matter accumulates at the surface, while mineral weathering proceeds at depth, creating vertical gradients in chemical composition and biological activity that will characterize terrestrial soils throughout Earth's subsequent history. The A horizon, rich in organic matter and biological activity, develops above the B horizon where clays and metal oxides accumulate, establishing the pedological architecture that supports terrestrial plant communities. This soil profile development occurs slowly, requiring centuries or millennia to establish the distinct layers that characterize mature forest soils. Nutrient cycling accelerates as organic matter decomposition releases nitrogen, phosphorus, and other essential elements that have been incorporated into plant tissues through photosynthesis and mineral uptake. The cycling of these nutrients through decomposition and uptake creates closed loops that retain fertility within terrestrial ecosystems rather than allowing nutrients to wash directly into marine environments. The efficiency of nutrient retention increases as soil organic matter accumulates and mycorrhizal networks develop, creating terrestrial ecosystems with nutrient cycling capacity that rivals that of marine environments. Only took terrestrial ecosystems 50 million years to invent composting. The transformation of fresh plant material into stable humus compounds proceeds through complex biochemical pathways that involve hundreds of different organic molecules and dozens of enzyme systems. The end products of this decomposition process, humic and fulvic acids, resist further breakdown and accumulate in soil profiles where they influence water retention, nutrient availability, and soil structure for decades or centuries. Moisture retention in forest floor environments creates conditions that buffer terrestrial organisms against seasonal droughts and daily temperature fluctuations. The organic matter acts like a sponge, absorbing water during wet periods and releasing it slowly during dry spells, moderating the extremes of terrestrial climate that would otherwise limit biological activity. This hydrological buffering enables the establishment of terrestrial communities that include organisms sensitive to desiccation, expanding the diversity of life that can persist in terrestrial environments. Carbon sequestration in terrestrial soils represents the first substantial removal of atmospheric carbon dioxide through biological processes operating on land surfaces. Each fallen leaf, each decomposing root, each fragment of woody tissue contributes to growing pools of soil organic matter that lock atmospheric carbon into terrestrial reservoirs. The carbon storage capacity of early forest soils remains modest compared to later ecosystems, but it establishes the terrestrial carbon cycling processes that will influence global climate throughout Earth's subsequent history. The chemical complexity of soil solutions increases dramatically as organic decomposition products interact with mineral weathering processes, creating biochemical environments that support increasingly diverse microbial communities. Organic acids produced by decomposing plant material accelerate the weathering of primary minerals while forming stable complexes with metal ions that influence nutrient availability and soil chemistry. These complex chemical interactions create unique microenvironments within soil profiles that support specialized communities of bacteria, fungi, and primitive soil animals. pH buffering by organic matter moderates the acidity that results from organic acid production and mineral weathering, creating soil chemical conditions that remain relatively stable despite ongoing biochemical processes. The buffering capacity of organic matter prevents the extreme acidity that would inhibit plant growth and microbial activity, maintaining soil chemical conditions within ranges that support diverse biological communities. This chemical stability enables the development of complex soil ecosystems that persist through seasonal and annual variations in temperature and moisture. Soil structure development begins as organic matter creates aggregates that resist erosion while maintaining pore spaces for water infiltration and gas exchange. The binding properties of decomposing organic matter and fungal hyphae create stable soil aggregates that protect soil organic matter from further decomposition while facilitating root penetration and water movement. The development of stable soil structure enables the establishment of increasingly complex terrestrial plant communities that can exploit deeper soil profiles and more diverse nutrient sources. The temporal dynamics of organic matter accumulation reflect seasonal patterns of plant growth and senescence, creating annual cycles of deposition and decomposition that establish rhythmic patterns in soil, chemical, and biological activity. Spring leaf-out mobilizes stored nutrients from decomposing organic matter, while autumn leaf fall adds fresh organic material that will support decomposer activity through winter months. These seasonal cycles in organic matter dynamics create predictable patterns of resource availability that influence the timing of biological processes in terrestrial ecosystems. Preservation of organic matter in anaerobic soil microsites begins the process that will eventually transform plant material into fossil fuels through geological processes operating over millions of years. Waterlogged depressions and poorly drained soil horizons create reducing conditions that slow decomposition and allow substantial accumulations of partially decomposed plant material. These early peat deposits represent the beginning of the geological processes that will create coal, oil, and natural gas from the organic productivity of Devonian and later terrestrial ecosystems. Arthropods venture into the vertical architecture of Earth's first forests, like explorers discovering dimensions that have never existed before. Pneumodesmus pneumani, a primitive millipede stretching barely a centimeter in length, navigates the complex topography of fallen logs and leaf litter with legs adapted for terrestrial locomotion rather than aquatic swimming. Its spirochelar respiratory system, the first known adaptation for atmospheric gas exchange in terrestrial arthropods, extracts oxygen directly from air through microscopic pores that connect to branching tracheal tubes, distributing respiratory gases throughout its segmented body. The forest canopy creates ecological niches unavailable in previous terrestrial environments, as arthropods exploit the three-dimensional habitat structure provided by branching trees and accumulating organic matter. Early arachnids develop primitive silk production, spinning the first terrestrial webs in spaces between tree branches and among fallen vegetation. These protospiders lack the sophisticated venom systems and web architectures of modern species, but their ability to produce protein acacia silk enables them to construct simple snares that capture small flying insects attempting to navigate forest environments. Arthropod body plans undergo rapid evolutionary modification as terrestrial life requires adaptations absent from aquatic ancestors. Exoskeletons must provide structural support against gravity while remaining flexible enough to permit locomotion across uneven terrestrial surfaces. The development of jointed legs with specialized segments for walking, climbing, and grasping represents a fundamental reorganization of arthropod anatomy that will persist throughout the subsequent evolutionary history of terrestrial invertebrates. Scientists studying early terrestrial arthropods encounter exceptional fossil preservation in locations where rapid burial or mineral replacement captures fine anatomical details, including respiratory structures, digestive systems, and even soft tissues. The Rhynie chert deposits preserve arthropods in three-dimensional detail that reveals the sophistication of early terrestrial adaptations, while amber-like resins from primitive plants occasionally entomb small arthropods with extraordinary fidelity. These exceptional preservation events provide windows into terrestrial ecosystems that would otherwise remain invisible in the fossil record. Respiratory adaptations enable arthropods to exploit atmospheric oxygen concentrations that exceed those available in aquatic environments, supporting larger body sizes and more active metabolisms than possible in water-breathing relatives. The evolution of tracheal systems represents one of the most significant physiological innovations in arthropod history, enabling direct delivery of oxygen to individual cells without relying on circulatory systems for respiratory gas transport. This respiratory efficiency will eventually enable the evolution of giant arthropods during periods of elevated atmospheric oxygen concentration. Feeding relationships in early terrestrial food webs remain relatively simple compared to the complex trophic interactions that characterize later terrestrial ecosystems. Most arthropods feed directly on decaying plant material or function as predators consuming other arthropods, creating food webs with only 2 or 3 trophic levels. The absence of large terrestrial vertebrates means that arthropods face few predation pressures beyond those imposed by other arthropods, enabling the evolution of relatively undefended body plans and behavioral strategies. Only took arthropods 20 million years to discover that forests have more hiding places than ocean floors. The structural complexity of terrestrial plant communities creates microhabitats with distinct environmental conditions, moist spaces beneath logs, dry surfaces of exposed bark, humid zones within leaf litter layers that support specialized arthropod communities adapted to particular microenvironmental conditions. This habitat heterogeneity enables the coexistence of arthropod species with different environmental requirements within single forest stands. Primitive insects begin experimenting with powered flight, developing wing structures that will eventually enable them to exploit three-dimensional forest environments more efficiently than any other group of terrestrial animals. The earliest flying insects possess wings that cannot be folded against the body, limiting their maneuverability in dense vegetation but enabling dispersal across distances that would be impossible for walking arthropods. The evolution of flight represents perhaps the most significant innovation in arthropod locomotion since the development of jointed legs. Chemical communication systems develop as arthropods adapt to terrestrial environments where visual and acoustic signals may be limited by vegetation and background noise. Primitive pheromone production enables mate recognition and territory marking across distances greater than direct contact, while chemical trail-following behaviors allow social coordination among related individuals. These chemical communication systems will eventually evolve into the sophisticated semiochemical interactions that characterize modern terrestrial arthropod communities. Reproductive strategies adapt to terrestrial conditions that lack the aquatic environments where most arthropod ancestors completed their life cycles. Internal fertilization becomes more common as arthropods develop mechanisms to protect gametes and developing embryos from desiccation, while some species evolve direct development that eliminates vulnerable aquatic larval stages. These reproductive innovations enable arthropods to complete their entire life cycles in terrestrial environments without dependence on aquatic habitats for reproduction. The diversity of arthropod feeding strategies increases as terrestrial environments provide novel food resources unavailable in aquatic ecosystems. Detritivories process fallen plant material. Predators consume other arthropods, and primitive herbivores begin to exploit living plant tissues. The development of herbivory requires physiological adaptations to process cellulose and cope with plant defensive compounds, establishing the evolutionary arms race between plants and herbivorous arthropods that will drive much of terrestrial evolutionary innovation. Seasonal activity patterns emerge as arthropods adapt to terrestrial climates with more pronounced seasonal variation than most aquatic environments. Some species develop dormancy mechanisms that enable survival through unfavorable seasons, while others time their reproductive cycles to coincide with periods of optimal environmental conditions. These seasonal adaptations require physiological mechanisms for detecting environmental cues and coordinating life history events with predictable environmental changes. The colonization of terrestrial environments by arthropods proceeds through multiple independent evolutionary events, as different arthropod lineages develop terrestrial adaptations at different times and through different evolutionary pathways. Some groups transition gradually from aquatic to terrestrial life through amphibious intermediate stages, while others appear to make relatively rapid evolutionary transitions to fully terrestrial existence. This multiple colonization pattern creates terrestrial arthropod communities composed of species with diverse evolutionary histories and ecological adaptations. Fossil arthropod trackways preserved in ancient sediments provide evidence for arthropod behavior and locomotion in early terrestrial environments. These trace fossils reveal information about arthropod activity patterns, substrate preferences, and social behaviors that cannot be inferred from body fossils alone. The preservation of trackways requires specific sedimentary conditions, but when present, they provide unique insights into the ecology and behavior of extinct terrestrial arthropod communities. Size constraints on terrestrial arthropods reflect the limitations of exoskeletal architecture and tracheal respiratory systems under terrestrial conditions. The inverse relationship between body size and surface area limits the efficiency of gas exchange through spirochelar systems, while the strength-to-weight ratio of chitinous exoskeletons limits the maximum size that can be achieved without compromising structural integrity. These biomechanical constraints will influence arthropod evolution throughout their subsequent terrestrial evolutionary history. Seeds emerge from the evolutionary laboratories of late Devonian plants, like encrypted messages addressed to uncertain futures. These remarkable structures, embryonic plants packaged with nutritional resources and protective coats, represent one of the most significant innovations in the history of terrestrial life, enabling plants to reproduce without dependence on water for fertilization and to disperse their offspring across distances measured in kilometers rather than meters. The earliest seed-like structures develop within specialized reproductive organs that protect developing embryos from desiccation while providing chemical and physical barriers against fungal infection and mechanical damage. The architecture of primitive seeds demonstrates elegant solutions to the challenges of terrestrial reproduction, as multiple tissue layers create microenvironments that maintain optimal conditions for embryonic development despite external environmental fluctuations. The seed coat derived from integumentary tissues surrounding the developing ovule functions as both protective barrier and selective membrane, regulating water and gas exchange while excluding pathogens and maintaining structural integrity during extended dormancy periods. Within this protective envelope, the embryo remains suspended in a state of metabolic quiescence that can persist for months, years, or in some cases, decades. Nutritional provisioning within seeds enables plant embryos to achieve substantial growth before they must rely on photosynthesis for energy production, providing competitive advantages in environments where seedling establishment requires rapid resource acquisition and structural development. The endosperm and other nutritive tissues contain concentrated stores of carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids that fuel embryonic growth during germination and early seedling development. This parental investment in offspring nutrition represents a fundamental shift from the reproductive strategies of spore-producing plants, which provide minimal resources to support the independent gametophyte generation. Scientists studying the evolution of seed plants encounter fossils that reveal intermediate stages between spore-based reproduction and fully developed seed structures, suggesting that the transition occurred through gradual modifications of existing reproductive systems rather than sudden evolutionary leaps. Archaeosperma and other late Devonian seed-like structures display anatomical features that combine characteristics of both spores and seeds, indicating experimental evolutionary solutions to the challenges of terrestrial reproduction. The fossil record preserves evidence of numerous evolutionary experiments in reproductive strategy, many of which represent evolutionary dead ends that provided no descendants to modern floras. The chemical composition of seed coats includes complex polymers and secondary metabolites that provide protection against herbivory, fungal attack, and environmental stresses including ultraviolet radiation, extreme temperatures, and chemical toxins. These defensive compounds often derive from the same biosynthetic pathways that produce structural polymers like lignin, illustrating the evolutionary efficiency achieved when metabolic systems serve multiple adaptive functions. The diversity of seed coat chemistry reflects adaptation to different dispersal mechanisms and environmental conditions. Dispersal mechanisms associated with early seeds remain relatively simple compared to the elaborate strategies that will evolve in later plant lineages, but they enable plant populations to colonize new habitats and maintain genetic connectivity across fragmented landscapes. Wind dispersal becomes possible as some seeds develop wing-like extensions or other morphological features that increase their surface area relative to mass, allowing them to remain airborne for extended periods. The physics of seed dispersal involves complex interactions between seed morphology, air density, and atmospheric turbulence. Only took plants 40 million years to invent biological time capsules that could wait for better weather. The evolution of seed dormancy mechanisms enables plants to time germination with environmental conditions favorable for seedling establishment, avoiding the high mortality that would result from germination during unfavorable seasons or years. Dormancy requirements vary among species and populations, reflecting adaptation to local climate patterns and disturbance regimes that create opportunities for successful establishment. The development of heterospory. The production of distinct male and female spores establishes the foundation for seed evolution by creating separate gametophyte generations specialized for different reproductive functions. Male gametophytes become reduced to pollen grains that can be transported by wind or primitive animal vectors, while female gametophytes remain associated with sporophyte tissues that provide protection and nutritional support. This reproductive division of labor increases fertilization efficiency while reducing the vulnerability of gametophytes to environmental stress. Genetic advantages of sexual reproduction become particularly important in terrestrial environments where environmental conditions vary spatially and temporally on scales that exceed the adaptive capacity of individual genotypes. Seeds enable genetic recombination and the production of genetically diverse offspring that may possess novel combinations of traits suited to unpredictable environmental conditions. The genetic diversity maintained through sexual reproduction provides raw material for evolutionary adaptation to changing environmental conditions. Germination physiology involves complex interactions between environmental cues, temperature, moisture, light quality, chemical signals, and internal regulatory mechanisms that control the transition from dormancy to active growth. Early seeds develop sensitivity to environmental conditions that correlate with favorable conditions for seedling establishment, including seasonal temperature patterns, day-length changes, and chemical signals indicating suitable soil conditions. These physiological mechanisms enable seeds to integrate multiple sources of environmental information before committing to germination. The evolutionary transition from homospory to heterospory to seed production involves reorganization of entire life cycles, as the dominant sporophyte generation assumes reproductive functions previously performed by independent gametophytes. This transition requires coordinated changes in morphology, physiology, and development that affect every stage of the life cycle. The complexity of these changes suggests that seed evolution represents one of the major evolutionary transitions in the history of life, comparable to the evolution of multicellularity or photosynthesis. Pollination mechanisms in early seed plants rely primarily on wind transport of pollen grains, though some species may have developed relationships with arthropods that accidentally transfer pollen while foraging for other resources. The efficiency of wind pollination depends on population density, pollen production rates, and atmospheric conditions that affect pollen transport and viability. Animal pollination will not become common until the evolution of more sophisticated floral structures and the diversification of flying insects. Storage physiology enables seeds to maintain viability during extended periods of environmental stress or unfavorable conditions, extending the temporal window for successful reproduction beyond the immediate growing season. Seed tissues develop biochemical mechanisms that prevent oxidative damage, maintain membrane integrity, and preserve genetic material during dormancy periods that may last several years. The longevity of seed viability varies among species and depends on storage conditions including temperature, humidity, and oxygen availability. The ecological impact of seed evolution extends beyond individual plant reproduction to influence entire ecosystem dynamics, as seed-producing plants can colonize disturbed habitats more rapidly than spore-producing species and maintain population connectivity across fragmented landscapes. The ability to disperse genetic material over large distances enables seed plants to track shifting climatic conditions and colonize new habitats created by geological or climatic changes. These advantages will contribute to the eventual dominance of seed plants in most terrestrial ecosystems. Global temperatures begin their slow descent from the greenhouse warmth of the Middle Devonian, as atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations decline through the accelerating burial of organic matter in terrestrial sediments and the weathering of newly exposed rock surfaces. The climate system responds to these changes with the geological patience of ice sheets forming and melting across polar regions that have remained ice-free for tens of millions of years. Seasonal temperature contrasts become more pronounced as the moderating influence of high atmospheric carbon dioxide weakens, creating environmental conditions that favor plants adapted to periodic dormancy and resource conservation. Precipitation patterns shift across the slowly assembling supercontinent as changing atmospheric circulation creates new monsoon systems and alters the distribution of rainfall between wet and dry seasons. Interior regions of large landmasses experience increasingly continental climates characterized by hot summers, cold winters, and irregular precipitation that concentrates during specific seasons rather than remaining relatively constant throughout the year. These climatic changes create selective pressures for physiological adaptations that enable plants to survive extended periods of drought or cold while maintaining the capacity for rapid growth during favorable conditions. Forest composition changes gradually as climate-sensitive species experience population declines while cold-tolerant and drought-resistant lineages expand their geographic ranges and ecological dominance. Archaeopteris forests that dominated temperate regions during warmer periods retreat toward equatorial latitudes, or persist only in favorable microhabitats with reliable moisture and protection from temperature extremes. The geographic redistribution of forest types creates new biogeographic patterns that reflect the physiological tolerances and competitive abilities of different plant lineages under changing climatic conditions. Scientists studying late Devonian climate change encounter evidence from multiple proxy systems, oxygen isotope ratios in marine carbonates, changes in sediment composition indicating varying weathering intensities, shifts in the geographic distribution of climate-sensitive fossils that collectively document the transition from greenhouse to icehouse conditions. The integration of these diverse data sources requires careful consideration of local environmental factors that may influence proxy signals, as regional climate variations can produce patterns that differ from global trends. The interpretation of ancient climate records remains challenging due to the complexity of climate system responses to changing boundary conditions. Seasonal growth strategies become increasingly important as plants adapt to climates with pronounced wet and dry seasons or warm and cold periods that require temporary cessation of active metabolism. Deciduous habit begins to appear in some lineages as an adaptation to seasonal resource limitation, allowing plants to shed leaves during unfavorable periods and reduce metabolic costs while maintaining living stems and root systems. The coordination of leaf abscission with seasonal climate patterns requires sophisticated physiological mechanisms for detecting environmental cues and timing metabolic adjustments. Drought adaptations proliferate among terrestrial plant lineages as changing precipitation patterns create environments where water availability becomes the primary factor limiting plant growth and survival. Some species develop succulent tissues that store water during abundant periods, while others invest in deep root systems that can access groundwater during surface droughts. Waxy cuticles become thicker and more effective at preventing water loss, while stomatal control mechanisms become more sophisticated in their regulation of gas exchange versus water conservation. Only took global climate 50 million years to discover that ice caps make excellent thermostats. The formation of polar ice during late Devonian cooling episodes creates feedback mechanisms that amplify climate changes. As ice reflects solar radiation and reduces global temperatures while simultaneously lowering sea levels and exposing additional land surface to weathering processes that remove atmospheric carbon dioxide. These ice albedo feedbacks create potential for rapid transitions between glacial and interglacial conditions. Plant community dynamics accelerate as climate change creates opportunities for rapid species turnover and the establishment of novel ecological associations. Communities that have remained relatively stable for millions of years experience disruption as changing environmental conditions exceed the physiological tolerances of dominant species. The colonization of disturbed habitats by opportunistic species creates transient communities with species compositions that differ from both pre-disturbance assemblages and the climax communities that will eventually develop under new climatic conditions. Evolutionary innovation increases as environmental stress selects for novel physiological and morphological adaptations that enable plants to survive under conditions that challenge existing adaptive strategies. The rate of evolutionary change accelerates during periods of environmental instability, as populations experience strong selection pressures that favor genetic variants with enhanced tolerance for climatic extremes. Some lineages undergo adaptive radiation as they exploit new ecological opportunities created by climate change, while others face extinction as their adaptive capacity proves insufficient for rapidly changing conditions. Migration patterns of plant communities track shifting climate zones as species ranges expand and contract in response to changing temperature and precipitation patterns. Individual species migrate at different rates depending on their dispersal capabilities and generation times, leading to the disassembly of existing plant communities and the formation of novel species associations. These range shifts occur over thousands of years as populations track suitable habitat across continental landscapes that are themselves slowly changing through tectonic processes. Paleosol development records, changing weathering intensities, and soil formation processes as climate influences the balance between physical and chemical breakdown of parent material. Cooler temperatures and reduced precipitation slow chemical weathering while potentially increasing physical weathering through freeze-thaw cycles and reduced vegetation cover. Changes in soil formation processes affect nutrient availability and soil structure, influencing plant community composition and ecosystem function on timescales that extend far beyond individual plant lifespans. Atmospheric circulation patterns reorganize as temperature gradients between equatorial and polar regions increase, strengthening the intensity of atmospheric transport processes while altering the seasonal and geographic distribution of precipitation. The development of stronger trade winds and westerlies increases the efficiency of heat transport between different latitudinal zones, while creating more pronounced seasonal weather patterns in continental interiors. These circulation changes influence the distribution of moisture across terrestrial landscapes and the frequency of extreme weather events. Carbon cycle feedbacks become increasingly important as cooling temperatures reduce the rate of organic matter decomposition while simultaneously increasing the efficiency of carbon burial in terrestrial sediments. Slower decomposition rates allow greater accumulation of organic matter in soils and sediments, removing additional carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and potentially accelerating climate cooling. The strength of these feedback mechanisms depends on the balance between carbon sequestration through enhanced burial and carbon release through weathering of organic-rich sediments. Ocean-atmosphere interactions intensify as temperature differences between land and sea increase, driving stronger seasonal monsoons and more vigorous oceanic circulation patterns. The transport of heat and moisture between oceanic and continental regions becomes more efficient while also becoming more variable on seasonal and annual time scales. These enhanced ocean-atmosphere interactions create more dynamic climate systems with greater potential for rapid transitions between different climatic states. Rivers carve new channels through landscapes transformed by the binding influence of terrestrial vegetation. Their courses stabilized by root systems that probe deep into alluvial sediments and anchor stream banks with organic architecture. The hydraulic geometry of Devonian waterways differs fundamentally from the braided, shifting channels that characterize pre-vegetation landscapes, as plant communities create roughness elements that reduce flow velocity while increasing channel depth and meandering complexity. Stream corridors become linear oases where moisture-dependent organisms persist during seasonal droughts, while riparian forests moderate temperature extremes and create shaded aquatic habitats that support increasingly diverse freshwater communities. The mechanical properties of plant-stabilized sediments alter fundamental relationships between discharge, sediment transport, and channel morphology as root networks bind alluvial particles into cohesive matrices that resist erosion during flood events. Bank stability increases dramatically where terrestrial vegetation establishes dense root systems, enabling the development of deeper channels with steeper sides that can accommodate larger flood discharges without catastrophic channel widening. These morphological changes reduce the frequency of avulsion events that previously redirected entire river systems across floodplains during major floods. Sediment grain size distributions in river systems change as vegetation traps fine particles during overbank flooding while allowing coarser material to continue downstream, creating downstream fining patterns that reflect the filtering effects of riparian plant communities. The preferential retention of clay and silt particles in vegetated floodplains reduces the turbidity of river water while simultaneously building fertile alluvial soils that support increasingly productive riparian ecosystems. These sedimentological changes alter aquatic habitat quality and the geochemical processes that control water chemistry in freshwater environments. Scientists studying ancient river systems encounter sedimentary structures and depositional patterns that record the transition from pre-vegetation to vegetation-influenced fluvial processes. As meandering channel deposits become more common, while braided stream signatures decline in the geological record. The interpretation of these paleo-channel deposits requires understanding of how plant communities influence hydraulic processes and sediment transport, as vegetation effects on river morphology create distinctive sedimentary architectures that can be recognized in ancient rock formations. These studies reveal that the evolution of terrestrial vegetation fundamentally altered continental surface processes. Chemical weathering accelerates in areas where plant roots penetrate bedrock and soil profiles, as organic acids and root exudates mobilize mineral nutrients while simultaneously increasing the surface area available for water rock interactions. The biochemical weathering processes associated with vegetation create more intense chemical alteration of bedrock than occurs through purely abiotic processes, accelerating the formation of clay minerals and the release of dissolved ions that contribute to river water chemistry. These enhanced weathering rates increase the flux of nutrients to freshwater and marine ecosystems. Flood dynamics transform as vegetation increases surface roughness and reduces runoff velocities, creating more gradual flood peaks with longer recession times that allow greater infiltration of water into soil profiles. The hydrological buffering provided by terrestrial plant communities reduces the severity of downstream flooding while maintaining more stable baseflow conditions during dry periods through enhanced groundwater recharge. These changes in flood hydrology affect the timing and magnitude of sediment transport events and the delivery of nutrients to aquatic ecosystems. Only took rivers 300 million years to learn that trees make better banks than bare rock. The establishment of riparian forests creates positive feedbacks between vegetation establishment and channel stability. As successful plant colonization improves habitat suitability for additional plant establishment, while simultaneously reducing the erosive forces that threaten vegetation survival. These feedback relationships enable the development of stable plant-dominated riparian corridors that persist through multiple flood-drought cycles. Aquatic habitat complexity increases as terrestrial vegetation contributes woody debris, leaf litter, and dissolved organic compounds to freshwater ecosystems, creating three-dimensional habitat structures and novel energy sources that support more diverse aquatic communities. Fallen logs create pools and riffles that increase habitat heterogeneity while providing substrate for aquatic invertebrates and attachment sites for aquatic plants. The input of terrestrial organic matter fundamentally alters aquatic food webs by providing energy sources independent of in-stream primary production. Water quality changes as terrestrial vegetation influences the chemistry of surface runoff through uptake of dissolved nutrients, release of organic compounds, and modification of soil chemical processes that control the composition of groundwater discharge. Plant communities act as biogeochemical filters that remove excess nutrients from surface waters while adding organic compounds that influence pH, dissolved oxygen concentrations, and the availability of trace elements essential for aquatic life. These water quality changes affect the composition and productivity of freshwater biological communities. Groundwater hydrology becomes increasingly coupled to surface vegetation as deep root systems create preferential flow pathways that facilitate water movement between surface and subsurface environments. The transpiration demands of terrestrial plants create suction forces that draw groundwater toward the surface, while simultaneously increasing infiltration rates through enhanced soil porosity and organic matter content. These plant-groundwater interactions stabilize water table elevations and maintain more consistent discharge rates in perennial streams. Stream temperature regimes, moderate as riparian vegetation, provides shade that reduces diurnal temperature fluctuations, while evapotranspiration creates cooler, more humid microclimates along stream corridors. The thermal buffering provided by riparian forests enables temperature-sensitive aquatic organisms to persist in watersheds that might otherwise experience temperature extremes incompatible with aquatic life. These microclimate effects extend the geographic range of cool water aquatic species while creating thermal refugia during periods of extreme weather. Erosion rates decline across watersheds as vegetation cover increases surface protection, while root systems bind soil particles and reduce susceptibility to mass wasting events. The development of terrestrial plant communities creates more stable landforms with reduced rates of hill slope erosion and channel incision, enabling the preservation of floodplain surfaces and the development of mature soil profiles. These geomorphological changes alter the long-term evolution of drainage systems and landscape topography. Nutrient spiraling in stream ecosystems becomes more complex as terrestrial organic matter inputs provide additional carbon sources, while riparian vegetation creates retention structures that slow downstream transport of nutrients and organic matter. The increased residence time of materials in vegetated stream corridors enhances processing efficiency and reduces nutrient export to downstream ecosystems. These biogeochemical changes affect the productivity and species composition of both freshwater and receiving marine communities. Channel migration rates decrease as bank vegetation provides erosion resistance that maintains channel position over longer time periods, reducing the frequency of meander cutoff events and oxbow lake formation. The stability of vegetated channels enables the development of more mature riparian ecosystems that can persist through multiple generations of plant succession, creating habitat continuity that supports species requiring long-term habitat stability. These geomorphological changes influence the patch dynamics and biodiversity patterns of riparian landscapes. The late Devonian mass extinction unfolds across millions of years like a slow-motion catastrophe, claiming marine species with methodical persistence while terrestrial forests continue their patient expansion across continental surfaces. Ocean chemistry deteriorates through cascading failures of biogeochemical cycles as hydrogen sulfide rises from anoxic deep waters and carbonic acid dissolves the calcium carbonate shells of marine organisms that have constructed reef ecosystems for tens of millions of years. The Kellwasser extinction events eliminate perhaps 75% of marine species, yet terrestrial plant communities experience minimal disruption, their root systems continuing to extract nutrients from soil while their canopies photosynthesize in atmospheric conditions that remain relatively stable. Marine ecosystems collapse as the intricate food webs that have supported diverse biological communities since the Ordovician radiation succumb to environmental stresses that exceed the adaptive capacity of most ocean-dwelling lineages. Trilobites, those ancient arthropods that have crawled across seafloors for nearly 300 million years, dwindle toward final extinction as their shallow marine habitats experience repeated episodes of anoxia and ocean acidification. The last trilobite species persist in isolated refugia where local environmental conditions remain tolerable. But their evolutionary trajectory leads inexorably toward termination of one of Earth's most successful invertebrate lineages. Terrestrial plant communities demonstrate remarkable resilience to the environmental changes that devastate marine ecosystems, suggesting that the causal mechanisms of late Devonian extinctions affect marine and terrestrial environments through different pathways or intensities. Forests continue to diversify and expand their geographic ranges, while ocean communities experience wholesale reorganization, indicating that terrestrial ecosystems possess buffering mechanisms absent from marine environments, or that the environmental stresses primarily affect oceanic rather than atmospheric and terrestrial systems. Scientists studying the Devonian Carboniferous boundary encounter geochemical evidence for massive perturbations in global carbon cycling, as carbon isotope ratios in marine carbonates record fluctuations that reflect changes in the balance between organic matter production, burial, and oxidation. The magnitude of these isotopic excursions indicates carbon cycle disruptions comparable to those associated with other major mass extinction events. Yet, the specific mechanisms linking carbon cycle changes to biological extinction remain incompletely understood. The complexity of Earth system interactions during extinction events challenges efforts to identify single causal factors. Recovery patterns following extinction events reveal fundamental differences between marine and terrestrial ecosystems in their capacity for ecological reorganization and evolutionary innovation. Marine communities require millions of years to achieve biodiversity levels comparable to pre-extinction baselines, while terrestrial plant communities continue evolutionary diversification with minimal interruption. The differential recovery rates reflect differences in generation times, reproductive strategies, and environmental buffering between marine and terrestrial life, illustrating the independence of evolutionary processes operating in different environmental realms. The biogeographic legacy of late Devonian extinctions influences the distribution and composition of post-extinction biological communities, as survivors become ancestral to the lineages that will dominate Carboniferous and later ecosystems. Marine extinction creates ecological opportunities that enable previously subordinate groups to diversify and assume ecological roles formerly occupied by extinct lineages. While terrestrial ecosystems experience gradual transitions toward more complex community structures dominated by increasingly sophisticated plant architectures. Only took marine ecosystems 300 million years to discover that ocean chemistry changes can be more dangerous than asteroid impacts. The late Devonian extinctions proceed through environmental degradation rather than catastrophic physical destruction, creating selection pressures that favor organisms capable of tolerating deteriorating environmental conditions rather than those adapted to specific ecological niches. The gradual nature of extinction processes provides opportunities for evolutionary adaptation that are absent during more rapid catastrophic events. Continental positions during the late Devonian influence patterns of extinction and survival through their effects on oceanic circulation and regional climate patterns, as the assembly of Pangaea alters global environmental conditions in ways that affect biological communities differently across geographic regions. Some marine basins experience more severe environmental degradation than others, creating geographic patterns of extinction intensity that reflect regional variation in oceanic conditions. These biogeographic patterns provide insights into the environmental mechanisms driving extinction processes. Evolutionary innovation accelerates among surviving lineages as extinction creates ecological opportunities for adaptive radiation and the colonization of vacant ecological niches. The removal of dominant competitor species enables previously subordinate lineages to diversify and exploit resources that were previously monopolized by extinct groups. These post-extinction evolutionary radiations establish the taxonomic and ecological frameworks that will characterize biological communities throughout subsequent geological periods. The transition from Devonian to Carboniferous ecosystems marks fundamental changes in community structure and ecological processes, as the environmental conditions that supported Middle Paleozoic biological communities give way to different climate and oceanic regimes that favor different adaptive strategies. Terrestrial ecosystems enter a period of rapid diversification and increasing structural complexity that will culminate in the coal forests of the late Paleozoic, while marine ecosystems undergo thorough reorganization around new taxonomic groups and ecological relationships. Preservation biases in the fossil record complicate efforts to understand extinction and recovery processes, as the organisms most likely to be preserved as fossils may not represent the full spectrum of biological diversity present in ancient ecosystems. The preferential preservation of organisms with hard shells or skeletons creates apparent patterns in the fossil record that may exaggerate the severity of extinction among marine organisms, while underestimating diversity changes in soft-bodied terrestrial communities. These taphonomic effects require careful consideration when interpreting patterns of extinction and recovery. Climate feedbacks associated with mass extinction may either amplify or moderate environmental changes depending on the specific mechanisms involved and their relative magnitudes. The collapse of marine biological productivity could reduce carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere through biological processes, potentially accelerating greenhouse warming, while the burial of organic matter in terrestrial sediments continues to sequester atmospheric carbon and moderate climate change. The net effect of these competing processes determines whether biological extinction accelerates or decelerates environmental change. Ecosystem services provided by biological communities change fundamentally during extinction events, as the loss of key functional groups disrupts biogeochemical cycles and reduces the capacity of ecosystems to regulate environmental conditions. Marine ecosystems lose much of their capacity for calcium carbonate precipitation and biological carbon pumping, while terrestrial ecosystems maintain their roles in weathering enhancement and atmospheric oxygen production. These changes in ecosystem function influence environmental conditions and recovery trajectories following extinction events. The temporal resolution of geological records limits understanding of extinction processes that may occur over timescales ranging from thousands to millions of years. As sedimentary rock formations cannot preserve evidence of environmental and biological changes that occur more rapidly than sediment accumulation rates, the apparent gradual nature of some extinction events may reflect limitations of geological time resolution rather than the actual pace of environmental change, requiring integration of high-resolution records from multiple locations to understand extinction dynamics. The forests of the late Devonian settle into geological memory like sediment accumulating in quiet lake basins, their cellular architecture slowly transforming into the molecular signatures that will persist in rock formations for hundreds of millions of years. Archaeopteris trunks that once cast shadows across ancient floodplains surrender their lignified tissues to burial and compression, beginning the slow metamorphosis that will concentrate their stored solar energy into coal seams buried beneath continents that have yet to assemble. The carbon fixed by photosynthesis during Earth's first forest epoch enters geological storage systems that operate on timescales measured in eras rather than seasons. Individual trees that may have lived for decades or centuries become instantaneous moments in deep time, their growth rings recording annual climate variations that fade into statistical noise against the background of continental drift and mountain building. The physiological struggles of drought years and the abundance of favorable growing seasons compress into microscopic bands of cellular tissue that preserve information about ancient atmospheric composition and precipitation patterns. These archives of environmental history remain locked within fossilized wood, awaiting discovery and interpretation by scientists who will not exist for another 380 million years. Spores released by dying forests drift across landscapes that will become unrecognizable through tectonic processes that relocate continents and reshape ocean basins according to the dictates of mantle convection. Some spores settle into sedimentary deposits where they fossilize with exceptional preservation, maintaining their sculptured walls and biochemical signatures as testimony to reproductive strategies that succeeded in colonizing terrestrial environments for the first time in Earth's history. The geographic distribution of these microscopic fossils provides evidence for ancient climate patterns and continental configurations. The mycorrhizal networks that connected forest communities across ancient landscapes decompose into soil organic matter that influences biogeochemical cycles for millennia after the death of their plant partners. Fungal hyphae that once transmitted nutrients and chemical signals between trees contribute their complex organic molecules to the development of soil horizons that will support countless generations of plant communities. The biochemical legacy of these early terrestrial partnerships persists in soil chemistry and structure long after the specific organisms that created them have vanished from the biological record. Atmospheric oxygen concentrations stabilize at levels that will enable the evolution of large, active animals in subsequent geological periods, as the photosynthetic output of Devonian forests establishes new equilibrium conditions between oxygen production and consumption. The chemical signature of this atmospheric transformation preserves itself in the oxidation states of iron minerals and the isotopic composition of sedimentary rocks that record environmental conditions during Earth's first major terrestrial oxygenation event. These geochemical archives document the global impact of terrestrial plant evolution. Continental surfaces bear the permanent imprint of their first encounter with complex terrestrial ecosystems. As soil profiles and weathering patterns established during the Devonian period influence landscape evolution and hydrological processes throughout subsequent geological history. The enhanced chemical weathering driven by plant root systems and organic acid production accelerates the formation of clay minerals and the release of nutrients that support marine productivity. These biogeochemical feedbacks link terrestrial ecosystem development to global elemental cycles. Only took the first forests 50 million years to permanently alter the chemical composition of Earth's atmosphere, oceans, and continental surfaces. The evolutionary innovations that enabled terrestrial plant life vascular tissues, lignified support structures, complex reproductive systems persist virtually unchanged in modern ecosystems, demonstrating the fundamental soundness of adaptive solutions developed during the initial colonization of land. The basic architectural principles of terrestrial plant communities remain constant across geological time. River systems carved by vegetation stabilize flow regimes, create channel patterns and floodplain architectures that influence sedimentary depositional environments throughout the remainder of Earth's history. The meandering channels and fine-grained floodplain deposits, characteristic of vegetated landscapes, replace the braided stream systems and coarse alluvial fans that dominated pre-vegetation continental surfaces. These changes in fluvial processes affect the preservation potential of terrestrial fossils and the development of economically important sedimentary rock formations. Evolutionary lineages that trace their ancestry to Devonian terrestrial pioneers persist as dominant components of modern ecosystems. Their basic physiological and morphological adaptations refined through hundreds of millions of years of selection, but retaining the fundamental innovations that enabled the initial conquest of land. The cellular mechanisms of water transport, the biochemical pathways of lignin synthesis, the architectural principles of root system design all remain essentially unchanged from their Devonian origins. These ancient innovations continue to function in contemporary forests. The mass extinction events that eliminated many marine lineages during the late Devonian create evolutionary bottlenecks that influence the trajectory of biological evolution throughout subsequent geological periods. The taxonomic groups that survive extinction events become ancestral to the diverse biological communities of later eras, while entire evolutionary lineages disappear forever from the fossil record. The contingent nature of extinction and survival during mass extinction events demonstrates the role of chance in determining evolutionary outcomes. Sedimentary rocks formed from Devonian forest ecosystems provide raw materials for industrial processes that power modern human civilization. As coal deposits concentrate the stored energy of ancient photosynthesis into fossil fuels that release carbon dioxide sequestered from Paleozoic atmospheres. The economic geology of coal formation links contemporary energy production to biological productivity that occurred during Earth's first major episode of terrestrial ecosystem development. These connections illustrate the deep time relationships between ancient biological processes and modern human activities. Paleontological research continues to reveal new aspects of Devonian terrestrial ecosystem structure and function as improved analytical techniques enable more detailed studies of fossilized plant and animal remains. Each new discovery adds complexity to understanding of early terrestrial life, while simultaneously demonstrating the sophisticated ecological relationships that existed during the initial phases of terrestrial ecosystem development. The incomplete nature of the fossil record ensures that many aspects of Devonian terrestrial ecology remain mysterious. The global climate system established during the late Devonian transition from greenhouse to icehouse conditions creates boundary conditions that influence atmospheric and oceanic circulation patterns throughout the late Paleozoic era. The development of polar ice caps and seasonal climate regimes establishes environmental frameworks that persist through multiple glacial-interglacial cycles and influence the evolution of climate-adapted biological communities. These climate transitions demonstrate the sensitivity of Earth's environmental systems to changes in atmospheric composition and continental configuration. Modern forest ecosystems retain structural and functional characteristics that originated during the Devonian colonization of terrestrial environments. As the fundamental challenges of terrestrial life-water transport, structural support, nutrient acquisition require adaptive solutions that remain optimal across geological time. The similarity between Devonian and contemporary forest architecture illustrates evolutionary convergence on engineering solutions that represent optimal compromises between competing physiological and mechanical constraints. These ancient design principles continue to govern terrestrial ecosystem organization. Time moves forward with the patience of continents finding their way home across oceanic distances, measured in the slow accumulation of sedimentary layers and the gradual decay of radioactive isotopes. The Devonian forests fade into the geological past, like memories settling into the depths of planetary consciousness. Their legacy preserved in every modern tree, every breath of oxygen-enriched air, every grain of soil weathered from bedrock by the chemistry of life. Deep time carries their innovations forward into futures they could never have imagined. Across eons yet to unfold beneath stars that burn with nuclear fires ignited from the same primordial elements that built the first forest communities on Earth's ancient shores.